Television rules the nation.
Basically, I tell people we need to change our language so we understand what's going on. The idea, we keep talking about these viruses, but quite frankly, we have some proven technology that can cause disease, but what is unproven is viral transmission, especially airborne viral disease. So let's turn our thinking more and let's move over to the idea that they're using toxins against us. You know, in Latin, virus means toxin. And in ancient medicine, the only two treatments are purification and detoxification. And we've lost sight of that, and we've gone to this idea that these little animalcules float out of our mouth and make people sick. And everybody says, well, but I know people get sick. Yes, but you can get sick for other reasons. And I think I want to start there, actually, because it leads into all this. And it's maybe not what you're going to expect, but there, in the 1930s and 1920s in Russia, in the Soviet Union, and trust me, the Russians are way ahead of us on this research, or at least way ahead of what we're being told we have. There was a guy named Kazanachev, and this is what he did. He took a tissue and he divided it in two parts, and he put cells into one container from half of the tissue and cells in a container B, let's say, from the other cells. And then he connected them. And the only thing that connected them it was in one chamber, but separated between the tissues was an optical window. Then he took the first side of these cells and he blasted them with, let's say, irradiation. I mean, he was going to murder the cells some way, either with radiation, staphylococci, he could put in bacteria, he could put in arsenic, you name it. Whatever he put into side one, then he watched 12 hours later, he watched to see if side two started changing. Well, if the window glass was glass between those two chambers, nothing happened. But when he put in quartz, he started to see an effect. And what the effect was, and it was subsequently called the mitogenic effect, or my favorite is death photons, what he showed was that side B starts dying using the same pattern of death. If it was radiation, side B started dying from radiation. If it was arsenic, side B started dying with the same symptoms of arsenic death. Okay, so whatever was killing side A moved over to side B when they weren't physically connected. They were connected by an optical quartz window, and that quartz window allowed the UV, the difference between quartz and glass is quartz allows ultraviolet or near ultraviolet rays to get through. So that's why they named them the death photons, because they said something is being given off by these cells that is causing these other cells to get sick. Now, if we take a step back and we say, look, if this is happening, and we know that it has an electromagnetic signature, and we can capture that electromagnetic signature, just like Luc Montagnier showed and others, then we could program and we could broadcast disease. When people say, well, if there are no viruses, how can I get sick? I'm going to tell you this is how. Now, Royal Rife, they did a lot. Royal Rife was doing the opposite. Royal Rife was a very well-known scientist, also about the same time. He developed a microscope of 5,780 some parts that he handmade that had all quartz optics. And quartz allowed you to see all this radiation, all the UV light, all this different wavelengths. Now, he could get 15,000 magnification off a light microscope. What can we get today? 100 years later, we're stuck. Yes, there's a picture of Royal Rife, who was born near where my office is, actually. But here he is in 1929. Now, we are in 2022, and we are still hampered by having light microscopes that don't use a complete quartz system, don't use his patented lighting, and we can get maybe 2,500. But what did he tell us? Well, he told us a lot of things, and think if we'd gone down this road. He said that he could watch with this microscope, and this is pretty impressive in the days before Foley catheters. He sat there for over 24 hours, sometimes 36 hours, I guess, without moving to observe the live bacteria. And what he showed is that bacteria had what they call a pleomorphic phase. In other words, bacteria would morph into viruses and back again into bacteria, what he called viruses. Now, they were smaller things that were moving around. He called them viruses, but they aren't what we call viruses. And the other thing he noticed was that all these different things, whether it was tuberculosis or staphylococci, whichever one it was, they had a specific wavelength. They had a different color. So a different color meant a different wavelength. And so he developed the what he called the mortal oscillatory resonance, or MOR. It was a complementary wavelength or a non-complementary that could blast these things and kill them. There's a famous story, and I don't think it's apocryphal. I think this really happened. He went to multiple radio stations in San Diego, near where his lab was, and he asked them if they all simultaneously on one day would broadcast a particular frequency, a particular sound for a particular period of time. And after it was over, he announced, he said, "There, we have just cured tuberculosis in San Diego." Because what he showed is that if you find the right frequency, you can do lots of things. So he was doing good, but there's a potential to do evil. So I'm just going to say we have been, this knowledge has been hidden from us, but it was not hidden from the Germans. For example, they were doing it. Koznacheev's work was looked at in a famous lab in Germany, and guess what it was called? It was called Marburg. And what do we think about Marburg? We hear about Marburg. We hear about a virus, a Marburg. But to be honest, there are less than 600 cases of Marburg in the world. What's really going on here? So let's say I personally think we are looking at wavelength medicine, and we're looking at wavelength medical warfare. And ultimately, we are DNA, we are wavelength beings, and we can be manipulated that way.
Keep in mind this piece of key information, that everything is energy, and that's all there is to it. This is not philosophy, this is just physics. I'm Dr. Jared Bergman. So let's take a look at our health and how that affects us. So we know all of these things bombarding us. You know, we have the light, and we have the radiation from it, we have smoke, we have all of these toxins out there. So what do? Well, we take our supplements, we exercise, we try and take care of ourselves, right? But without this key component addressed, the exposure to electromagnetic frequencies, we're spinning our wheels. No, I'm saying that all of these factors are very important, and you should implement all of these factors. But again, make sure you have this very important component in place in your life. Because what? Because everything is energy. Let's take a look at the cell. Let's take it down to a smaller view. That way we can get a better picture of the bigger outlook on things. So if we look at this cell, look at all these intricate parts to the cell. Well, a cell has a semicrystalline in matrix. So parts of the cell have basically crystals. What do crystals do? They hold information. They hold a resonance or almost a vibratory aspect to them.
If you want to damage a molecule, you need a certain minimum amount of energy. You need this energy to break the bonds between the atoms that make up the molecule. And so the most essential thing you need to know to gauge how harmful electromagnetic radiation is whether the energy per photon in the radiation is large enough to break molecular bonds, like the bonds that hold together the DNA. Breaking molecular bonds is not the only way electromagnetic radiation can be harmful, but it is the most direct and important harm electromagnetic radiation can do. So, how much energy do you need to damage a molecule? Damage begins happening just above the high energy end of visible light with the ultraviolet radiation. That's the light that gives you sunburn and that you've been told to avoid. It has wavelengths that are just a little bit shorter than visible light, or frequencies and energies that are just a little bit higher. In terms of energy, ultraviolet radiation has about 3 to 30 electron volts per photon. An electron volt is just a unit of energy. If that's unfamiliar to you, doesn't matter. You merely need to know that the binding energy of most molecules also lies in the range of a few electron volts. If you want to break a molecule, you need energies above that binding energy. So you need frequencies at or above the ultraviolet. That's because the energy for the damage has to come with the individual photons in the radiation. If the individual photons do not have enough energy to actually damage the molecule, they either just go through, or sometimes, if they hit a resonance frequency, they'll wiggle the molecule. If you wiggle molecules, that means you warm them up, you warm them up, you warm them up.
The breast. The breast is mostly fat, contains a lot of fluid. Things that contain fat and fluid cook faster in the microwave oven. Now, a cell phone can't cook anything, all right? Mobile phones do not pop popcorn. That was a fraud. They don't make any heat that we know of, otherwise they wouldn't be permitted. But they do go through things that contain fat and fluid, and we are now working at Environmental Health Trust with scientists at the University of California, San Francisco, scientists at formerly the president of the American Cancer Society of California, because we are seeing women who keep cell phones in their bras. Has anyone seen a woman put a cell phone in her bra? Hands up, please. Please tell them you've heard now why they shouldn't do that. And here I want to show you our first case report from 2009, and we now have many more. This was a Chinese-American woman who used her cell phone 4 hours a day in her bra for 10 years while she was driving. Now, and you drive with a phone on your body. The phone is smart. It's going to go from one tower to another, and it's going to say, here I am, where are you, here I am. And it's going to be going to max power each time it moves from one cell tower to another. And there it was right next to her chest. And the tumors that developed right under the antenna of the phone. Unusual tumors. Well, you know, that's a very good question. Does it apply to males who would put the phone in their breast pocket? We actually have cases now of men with unusual skin cancers or unusual growths where they've kept their phone in one place. And again, if they were phones would not be past testing approval if they were to do that. Male breast cancer is very rare, very, very rare. But we are seeing some reports of cases. And here, unfortunately, this is an MRI of a young woman, a very brave young woman named Tiffany France. When she was 21, she's now 22, she developed metastatic breast cancer. This is metastases into her chest wall right here. And this outlined the phone. And it was subcutaneous, so it's like right under the surface of the skin. It was not deep within the breast. Most breast cancer occurs in women over 50. It occurs in the upper outer quadrant. These tumors occurred right under the antenna of the phone. And now we have 38 of them. Not a single one of them has a family history. None of them has inherited the defects that we know increase the risk of breast cancer. They have multifocal tumors. That means they have more than one tumor, and the tumors are located under the antenna, sometimes just right in the center of the chest.
Take a look at a crystal glass, and when you hold it and you flick it with your finger, ding it, or you do that circle around the rim of it to create that noise, it vibrates to a certain pitch or a certain resonating frequency.
That's better. Okay. We're trying to find the frequency of the glass, and then we're going to play that frequency using these two apps.
Wait.
Yeah, do it one more time. Okay,
That sounds better.
1370. So then what happens is we're going to play that frequency on this phone. You can hear that. That's pretty close. And apparently if you play the same frequency over a glass that it gives off, it'll shatter. So we're gonna try and break that glass. Okay, yeah, do that. 71.
Maybe I should use the fork.
No.
Should I try the fork?
Hold it up just a little bit higher. 1372.
Closer to the phone? Is it supposed to like...
Right there, it should be fine. 1373. Hang on.
Maybe it's not. Maybe it's not loud enough.
I'll turn it up just a little bit.
Ooh.
There you can hear it, right?
Ooh.
Oh, there's glass on my phone. I can't believe that worked.
What he showed is that if you find the right frequency, you can do lots of things.
Well, similar to the DNA in the cell. The DNA is semicrystalline in matrix. So what happens is that vibratory state that takes place in the cell when the cell is slightly under pressure that emits photonic light from the cell, from your DNA component. And this photonic light can be measured with very sensitive, highly sensitive cameras. Carilion camera is the most widely used. So we have all these different components to this cell, and we have a field, an electrochemical field in the cell as well, made up of what? Well, the potassium, the sodium, magnesium, just to name a few. So this natural occurring electromagnetic field in the cell, in combination with the crystal matrix of the cell, creates what? Everything is energy, right? It creates energy. So when you have an electromagnetic, man-made electromagnetic signal coming in, that's chaotic in nature, by the way. So if you could hear what your cell is experiencing, it would drive you crazy.
The pulse that is erratic and irregular, like for thousands of minutes a month, for dozens of hours a week, over a lifetime, that irregular pulsed signal may be much more biologically important. And in fact, the continuous wave signals have a lot of therapeutic effects as are being applied in medicine today. This visualization from my colleague at the University of Athens shows you the variation in frequency, in amplitude, in pulse. All of these variables influence the properties a signal have and how it can affect a biological system. This is just to show you what happens in a 4-second mobile phone call. This is power density indicated here. And of course, a phone is on standby, it's not doing too much, but 900 times a minute, it's looking for a signal. It says to the tower, where are you? Here I am. Where are you? Here I am. It's smart. That's how it's supposed to do. Now, when the phone rings, the worst time for you to put a phone right next to your head is when you answer it and say hello, because it's smart and it goes to max power. They're programmed to do that. Max power. Now, it's going to go to max power. You're going to listen, and then it will go up and down and up and down. And again, it's that variation. It's the delta. It's the cumulative integrative dose under the curve over a lifetime of exposure that looks to be biologically important.
So let me do a little demonstration with the cell phone to show you. All right, so now we're going to turn this all the way to radio frequencies, okay? And I'm going to get it close to my cell phone right here. You can see it's pulsing, right? Because we have the cell tower is sending signals every so often. Okay, so now I'm going to actually make a call. I'm going to call Jared. So you can see that it's pulsing like this. So all these microwaves are going right to your brain if it's held up close to your skull.
Does it really use microwaves, like in microwave ovens? Is that something you should worry about? I began looking into this, fully convinced I'd tell you that this is the usual nonsense about cell phones causing cancer. But having looked at it in some more detail, now I'm not so sure.
There isn't one truth, of course. Truth is a relative term. When we talk about truth in science, of course, it's always relative. I've worked at some of the top institutions in the world in science, and so when I first thought there could be something wrong with mobile phones, I actually owned 3 phones at the time. I own 2 now. And everybody has to downsize a bit. And I didn't believe there was a problem, and I thought if there were a problem, I would know about it because, of course, I knew all about what was important in science. Well, I was wrong.
Doesn't probably need an awful lot of introduction, but Dr. Devra Davis is a visiting professor of medicine at the Hebrew University, Hadassah Medical School, and also in Turkey at the Ondokus Mayıs University. She's an expert studying the electromagnetic radiation for mobile phones and wireless transmitting devices at present. She was the founding director of the Center for Environmental Oncology, which was the first such center in the world, and was established at the University of Pittsburgh Cancer Institute. And he was looking at the environmental factors that contribute to cancers. In 2007, she founded a non-profit environmental health trust to provide basic research and education about environmental impact on health hazard. She served as President Clinton's appointee on the Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board in the United States from 1994 to 1999. That was an independent executive branch of the government that investigated all the effects of chemical accidents and how to prevent and mitigate against them. She was also a senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary for Health in the Department of Health and Human Services in the United States, and as such has counseled many leading officials in the United States, United Nations, World Bank, European Environmental Agency, the Pan American Health Organization, and the World Bank. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Psychology, a Master of Arts in Sociology. She has a PhD in Science from the University of Chicago, and she has a Master of Public Health in Epidemiology from the Johns Hopkins University. A lot of degrees. She has also more than 200 publications, and she's been published in Lancet and the Journal of American Medical Associations, which are some of the top journals in the field of medical research. And she, of course, has publications in Scientific American and the New York Times. All yours, please.
Thank you very much, Dean Mariels. I'm honored to be here. It's a privilege to see so many of you. You've mentioned some of my career. I won't go through this in any great detail, but I would say to you that probably the most important thing I did, and I see many people in this room aren't even old enough to remember it, but a long time ago, you used to have smoke on airplanes. People could smoke tobacco on airplanes. And I was involved as a young scientist in the committee that actually reviewed the data and recommended that there be no smoking on airplanes. You may be shocked to hear that it was even a question for science at the time, but it was. And when I look at what we know now about mobile phone radiation, I see some very interesting similarities because there were a lot of questions that were raised about the safety of tobacco on airplanes. And they were, in fact, legitimate questions, things we did not know. There are a lot of important questions to be asked about mobile phone radiation today, without any doubt. But the reality is we're not asking those questions. And with the exception of some researchers here and elsewhere, very little new research is being done in this field. I liked the fact that I could call people or actually send them messages and expect an answer at all hours of the day, and found it kind of fun in the beginning. And when somebody said to me there could be a problem with this with our health, I said, oh, don't be ridiculous. If there was a problem, I'd know about it. Well, I was wrong. And what I now know is that information is being sent to people routinely to give them safety information. I'm going to ask you to help me out here by looking at how many of you have an iPhone. Now, I assume you didn't all turn them off. So, For those of you who have an iPhone, would you raise your hand again? I'd like you to share with your colleagues. So please go to the settings on your phone, all right? Please take a moment and nod when you've got there. All right? And be prepared to share, all right? Go to settings on the phone. Got there? All right. Now, get to settings. Now go to about. I'm sorry, you have to go to general first. There's a mistake here. You have to go to general. All right? Under general, under settings. Then go to about, which is at the top. You got there? About? Yes? Okay. Now you have to scroll all the way down to something you don't normally see, called legal. You got to legal? All right. Now click on RF exposure. Now you can read it later, but it's basically telling you that you need to know that you cannot keep the phone directly next to your body without exceeding the as-tested exposure guidelines. And by the way, the iPhone does it. I happen to know how to find it on the iPhone. I'm just learning the Android system myself. But all smartphones come with some information that basically says, don't keep the phone in your pocket or you will exceed the as-tested exposure guidelines. Now, how many of you knew that before today? Well, this is a very well-informed audience relative to others. I want to thank Telstra because they actually are now giving people this information. And by the way, they're one of the first telecom companies in the world to do this. So I actually think it's a good thing. They're sending this message. How many of you have seen it? How many of you have actually looked at what it said? Well, here's what it says. This is what it says. And like most of you, I found messages like this annoying, but the reality is Telstra is telling you to use a hands-free device to keep a mobile phone away from the head and body to reduce mobile phone exposure. So that's a good thing. But on the other hand, I think that we all need to do better. You shouldn't have to find that information buried inside your phone. I mean, come on. That's not fair. Parents, teachers, and health professionals should be informed, and they in turn can work with students to make sure people are using technology in as safe a way as possible.
Thousands of studies about possible dangers illustrate that it's still seen as a very real threat. A lot of people claim to be sensitive to the radiation coming from our appliances and cell phones. They report symptoms like headaches, nausea, skin reactions, burning eyes, or exhaustion. But those are just effects reported on a day-to-day basis. A few studies have found much more unsettling results, like possible connections between the side of the brain which people use when they're on their phones and the appearance of brain tumors. The question that science is trying to answer is not so much about the acute effects of irradiation. We know, for example, that X-rays cause immediate damage to the DNA in your cells, but that the same doesn't happen with radio waves. The question is rather, is the sort of weak electromagnetic radiation we are constantly surrounded by harmful in the long run as a result of some as yet unknown mechanism?
Let's go back to almost 20 years ago when standards for cell phones were first set up. At that time, it was believed that the only thing you had to worry about was avoiding heat. That was the only effect you had to be concerned about. And so they employed the head of a very large person, a 220-pound male, who was at the top 98th percentile of military recruits in 1989 in the United States. And they set the standards to avoid heating up that fellow's brain after a 6-minute phone call. Now, there's probably 1 or 2 people in this room with a head that size. But the rest of you, like most of the world, have much smaller heads and relatively smaller bodies. And this standard, which is very much out of date, doesn't take into account the fact that people the size of these 2 bright young people here in the front row are using these devices today with no thought that maybe they're getting exposed to levels of radiation that have not been evaluated for their safety in young developing brains. This is from Arpanza. You will see here they say FM radio, microwave oven, radiant heat.
Like in microwave ovens.
Now, how many of you had heard that in 2011, the World Health Organization had reviewed all of the evidence and decided that mobile phone radiation was a possible human carcinogen. How many people had heard that? Okay. It's interesting that that information isn't more widely known, and we can explore the reasons for that perhaps at a later time. But the fact is, the group that reviewed this evidence for the World Health Organization looked at all the evidence at the time in 2011. At that time, they said it's important to conduct additional research and it's important to take pragmatic measures to reduce exposure. Of course, microwave oven actually happens to be of the same frequency as the cell phone, the mobile phone.
Let's talk about 4G, because 4G is 2.5 gigahertz. Do you know what else is 2.5 gigahertz? The microwave oven. The microwave oven is designated at the 2.4 gigahertz band specifically for microwave ovens. Now this is before, of course, 4G LTE came out, and that's dangerous enough. Now we're going to go into 5G, which is 2.5 gigahertz to 6 gigahertz in low band, and it goes up to something like 29 or 39 gigahertz for AT&T in the United States, or something like that. Some very, very high radiation, which is dangerous for many reasons.
Something called EMF, and try to break it down really simple. Stop frying your brain with your cell phone, radio waves or microwaves. You have a router, you might have a cell tower that is sending signals to your cell phone. And so if your phone is close to your head, your brain, you're going to be getting exposure to microwaves. Not to mention maybe some magnetic and electrical fields as well.
Two-dimensional modeling showed that children and smaller adults might absorb more radiation than larger adults. And this was scalar modeling that has now been superseded, done by Om Gandhi in 1996. Interestingly, and this is why I'm really delighted to be here, Dean, when he did this work in 1996, he was working with support from Motorola and the Department of Defense. And after he published this, he lost all his funding. Professor Gandhi, with whom I'm collaborating now, updated his work in 2002, here showing you that a smaller adult head here, you see the amount of exposure is quite similar, but because the head is smaller, it will absorb proportionally more. More recently, we have been working with colleagues at Porto Alegre with Environmental Health Trust, and we have developed three-dimensional modeling with anatomically based models using MRI to create the models with 1 millimeter voxels. And what we have done is to show the difference in radiation dose in heads of different ages and sizes. And I'll just show you one example here, coming from our colleagues at the Swiss National Institute of Technology, the ITIS, which have produced some of the most brilliant work in the world in this field. And they have shown here, of course, that there is going to be greater exposure absorption into a younger head versus an older head. This is another item from their website of target tissue dose for the infant with using a system called the virtual family. Is there anyone here who's worked on the virtual family? Right. It's a really powerful and very sophisticated system that is used today to set standards for medical devices and surgical procedures. But it's not used for mobile phone standards. I find that odd. And I want to show you an example of some of the work that we are doing now that I'm releasing here for the first time. And this is a modeled microwave radiation dose of a 6-year-old with greater levels to the frontal and temporal lobes, eyes and cheek. And watch this here. Now, yellow, white, and red are the hottest, all right? And if you look carefully, you will see it's going into the eye, the nose. Do it again, just so you'll get to see it. And partly into the brainstem. Now, that's just showing you that there's going to be some exposure into that area of a young head. It doesn't tell you that there's any biological effect, right? Now, the next slide is going to show you something that might be of interest to students and faculty here. And that has to do with exposure to the reproductive organs. We call them the gonads, I think you say the testicles, and bone marrow. And look here at the radiation as it gets into the groin area. And that's just from having a mobile phone modeled into the pocket. And this, again, is based on normalized SAR with a dipole antenna. And there are many different variables you can alter in coming up with this kind of simulation, right? The number of antenna, whether it's GSM, CDMA, whether it's simultaneously operating only one antenna or more than one. But we believe that this is the kind of work that needs to be done and that this institution might be in a position to do it. And my colleagues from Brazil would be happy to share with you the modeling that we have done to date to generate this. But based on this work and other studies that have been done around the world, the United States magazine Consumer Reports recently recommended that nobody keep a phone in their pocket. Nobody. And in fact, if phones were tested in pockets, they would exceed the as-tested exposure guidelines, which is why Telstra has recently issued that advice. Now, this is some new modeling, again, that we've developed with colleagues in Brazil, and we can share with you how we've done it. We first start out with the MRI and create the model with 1 millimeter voxels, and this is quite a bit of work goes into creating this, and here is what it looks like after a period of 6 minutes. That's really not as bad as it might look because you see the red area only gets partway through the eye of the adult, right? The one that we're really concerned about is this one with the young child. And this is a 3-year-old brain that we modeled. And you see that by the end of that 6-minute call, the peak radiation, yellow and red, is getting all the way into almost both eyes. And again, this is one call, and it's not going to kill anybody. It may not cause any biological effect whatsoever for 1 call or 2 calls or 3 calls. But the question is, what's the cumulative impact of this kind of exposure? How do we evaluate it? How do we study it? The problem we face is that right now, we're in the midst of an experiment on my grandchildren and your children, and we don't have anybody to compare them with. We don't have a control group in science. When you are given a drug, it's usually been studied where some people get the drug and some people don't get the drug, and they're called the controls. And then you see whether or not those who got the drug are healthier than those who did not. And when you get results, you can conclude, if there is a difference between the exposed and the control group, that your drug has worked. Well, when it comes to mobile phone radiation, our ability to have a true control group.
Hello, I'm Kevin Harrington, original shark from Shark Tank. Protect yourself against the harmful effects of mobile phone heat and radiation with the Hedron EMF Shield.
Our mobile devices aren't as friendly as you might think. Cell phone radiation is now classified as a possible carcinogen. Do you really want to hold that against your head? You need Hedron protection. Cell phones, Wi-Fi, cell towers, smart meters, even the electrical grid are all sending out electromagnetic interference. Harmonize EMI with the Hedron. EMI can cause headaches, brain fog, fatigue, trouble sleeping, nerve pain, and more. All Hedron products come with a 5-year warranty and a 60-day full refund guarantee. Protect yourself and those you love at HedronEMFProtection.com.
Imagine if you took the microwave door off your microwave and turned it on and left it on all day long next to a school. That's what we're talking about. So, what are the symptoms of microwave radiation while we're on the subject? So, when your tissues are directly exposed to microwaves, the same violent deformations occur and cause what's known as microwave sickness. Now, if you think that this is something that's kind of like not really a thing, I'm going to show you something from the Food and Drug Administration.
It makes our lives easier, safer, more fun, and most of us never think about it. But is there such a thing as too much electricity? Could the thing that is the foundation of the modern world slowly be killing us.
Cables, my backup on my computer, the actual screen itself, the Wi-Fi devices, the printer. And so all these things are bathing your body in these frequencies. And if you're sitting behind the computer like I do for a very long time, it's not healthy. So you're going to have to minimize the exposure and find out where it's coming from.
As you may know, the Earth gives off a very healing frequency called Schumann resonance. This is measured as 7.83 Hertz. That's why grounding or earthing can be very beneficial. Unfortunately, it's hard to be grounded all the time, and not all of Earth's ground is created equally. The great news is that with our patent-pending frequency embedding scalar energy technology, you can finally take the healthiest parts of the Earth with you wherever you go. So no matter where you go, you are always protected from bad EMF. Plus, we've even added special support for your biofield. What separates Hedron from the rest? Our patent-pending protection is the most tested and proven product of its kind in the world. Created by a team of doctors, scientists, and geophysicists. Numerous international test reports and certificates. Harmonizes radiation by 99.95%. Does not interfere with electronic device efficiency. Works in synergy with your biofield and healing capabilities. Be sure to check out all of the Hedron EMF harmonizing products today. Hedron Device Shield for your cell phone and electronic devices. Hedron Body Shield, personal EMF protection and harmonization. Hedron Pendant, personal EMF protection and harmonization with biofield expansion. Hedron Home Harmonizer, whole home protection from geopathic stress, Wi-Fi, cell towers, home electrical grid, and more. Click now and protect yourself and your family.
So let's take a look at one of our particular cases in the Carillion photography. So we measured a subject before a cell phone call. At the baseline, we had 27 organs out of 52 that were in the dangerous zone. Now we had this same subject make a cell phone call, and during the cell phone call, all 52 organs were out of range. Now, the next step was to put the Hedron cell phone harmonizer on the cell phone, then have the subject make the call. Now, look at what happened. 51 out of 52 organs are now in range. So what does this tell us? This tells us the person was better off with the cell phone and the harmonizer on the cell phone than no cell phone at all, right? So how can this be? How does this affect our body? Well, you have something called, with each cell, you have something called the cellular permeability. That is when the nutrients come in the cell and you detoxify what's in the cell, the waste of the cell, out of the cell. That's a naturally occurring process. But when you cause chaos in the cell via the electromagnetic frequency coming in, what that does is that locks the DNA, locks it down in a way where the cell, it can't operate the sodium, potassium pumps, calcium channels in the body. It can't get those toxins to move freely, nor can it get the nutrients to move freely. So when you can harmonize the cell in its energy or in its field, you create a healthier environment so that the cell can move more freely, so that the flow of toxin can go out of the cell. It balances that chaotic signal, decreasing the likelihood of you producing free radicals. Because if your cell is full of toxin, what's going to happen? What's going to start to break down? Via free radicals. Free radicals are going to tear it down. It's going to form oxidation. And when and if that oxidation gets so bad, that starts to damage your DNA. The specific energy that we utilize to help the body harmonize itself actually strengthens the hydrogen bonds within the cell, within the whole body. But what is important about those hydrogen bonds is it helps hold our DNA together and be more resilient. These are some of the more recent studies. Using the cell phone for 1 hour a day increases the risk of a mutagenic disease about 500%. The other numbers even higher for children because the absorption is so much greater for a child. For an adult, the absorption is like 25%. For a child under 5 years old or 5 years or younger, it is approximately 75% absorption. So these are definitely some things not to ignore because we are surrounded as a society by these frequencies. They're coming from everywhere. Now I believe over in Europe and I think in Canada now, they're requiring that the Wi-Fi units be taken away from the nurseries at least, which in reality, that's a step in the right direction. However, more needs to be done because that's definitely not a good enough step. The World Health Organization now officially classifies cell phones or cell phone radiation as a Class B carcinogen, but not enough is going into the prevention and protection for people at this point. There's so much information out there now. Prior to, I think it was 1986, there was only like 135 studies done on cellular communication devices and cell phones, things like that. After that, there are more than 2,000, and it's growing fast. So that's telling us that, yeah, we're looking at it, but how long do we have to wait before they come out with the information saying, well, oops, we have to take some preventative measures here.
When it comes to pregnancy, we're working with Yale University and more than 100 physicians and experts in the United States and around the world who are specialists in pregnancy. And we have been modeling exposure to the head at the end of pregnancy. And at the end of pregnancy, when of course the head, as any woman here knows, is right at the surface, if you're lucky it's at the surface and it's not facing the spine, then you can get the greatest exposure because of course the skin is completely permeable to this radiation exposure. And that's why we've developed the Baby Safe project with colleagues at Yale to advise pregnant women to protect their abdomens from mobile phone radiation as well as from iPads. Experimental studies have been supported by NATO on radar for years, and one of the laboratories they've supported is that of Professor Nesrin Sahan and her colleagues. And the Environmental Health Trust convened an international conference with her laboratory partners and the Ministry of Health of Turkey in 2011, and I want to show you briefly some of the work that developed from that laboratory. This is showing you cellular damage that occurred in animals that were prenatally exposed to mobile phone radiation that was produced by a computer simulating the mobile phone exposure under controlled conditions, right? So, because you can't really get rats to make phone calls. You've got to model the exposure. And what they did is they measured in, these are your controls that you compare things with, and these were the exposed. Prenatally exposed, just 15 minutes a day for 7 days. Not much exposure. But these are small animals, and they grow within 3 weeks. They reproduce. And what they were able to study was changes in liver malonaldehyde, which is a measure of peroxidation, is a measure of damage to the liver, right? So these animals basically had significant damage to their liver if they had been exposed prenatally compared to controls. Now, another group in Turkey has looked at prenatal effects on the brain and the testis. And, a lot of countries, this is a very important research that has been done here. And they looked at counting the number of cells in certain areas of the brain, the hippocampus, which is a critically important part of the brain. And since I see there's a lot of non-expert here, and let me just explain that your hippocampus is pretty important to things like memory, balance, things like that. So studying effects on the hippocampus in animals is kind of a good way to anticipate effects that might develop on intelligence and other things. And they looked at newborn rats after they had been exposed prenatally and compared those who were exposed to those who were not exposed. And they looked at their brain cells, the number of cells, their shape, etc., with established methods for testing this. And this article was published in Brain Research, which is a relatively high-impact journal. And what they showed was that prenatally exposed newborns have basically fewer cells in the hippocampus. Here's the exposed, missing some cells, and here are the controls, which they're compared with. And you can see here that these cells are, there's more of them. Here they're more scattered. And in fact, they did another test of memory. Now, how do you test memory in an animal? You don't have them fill out the crossword puzzle. You test memory in an animal with well-established protocols of learning. You teach them to run a maze and get a food reward. And you see how long it takes them to do that. And what they did, it's a radial arm maze. They trained these animals who were starving to get a food reward, right? And after they did that, they then saw how long did it take them to learn this if they had been prenatally exposed to mobile phone radiation. And what they found was that newborns that had been exposed took 3 times as long to find their way out of an experimental maze and made twice as many errors. And this, again, is a statistically valid method. When it comes to further work on the prenatal impacts, my colleagues at Yale University have taken mice, exposed them to mobile phone radiation, and they have found significant effects on those mice's behavior as adults, all right? Prenatally exposed mice have hyperactivity as adults. And these are some of the data. They have worse memory, they're more hyperactive, they have more anxiety, but they don't have much fear. It's kind of interesting. And because of that, that is why we've developed the Baby Safe Project, working with colleagues at Yale University and around the world. Now, closer to home, so to speak, between the brain and the testis, studies have been done here in Australia at Newcastle by a fellow who's now the pro-chancellor of the university. And these studies have been done taking sperm from healthy men. And one test tube gets exposed to cell phone radiation, and one test tube is not exposed to mobile phone radiation. And then the results are evaluated. And this is a measure of vitality. We measure how well the sperm swim. This is a measure of mobility, motility. This is a measure of mitochondrial DNA damage. They have 3 times as much damage on their DNA if they have been exposed to mobile phone radiation as compared to controls. And now the issue is, why does it take 500 million sperm to make just one healthy baby? It takes a lot of sperm to make a healthy baby. The answer is because sperm don't know how to ask for directions. But they are easy to study. And these research has been done in India, in the United States, at the Cleveland Clinic, and around the world. So many different studies have been done on sperm damage associated with mobile phone radiation that in the 7th edition of the textbook, Biostatistics in Medicine, Stanton Glantz concludes that the evidence linking mobile phone radiation to sperm damage is causal, meaning there clearly is a cause of damage to sperm from mobile phone radiation. Now, we have a lot of uncertainties in this field. The truth is, we have a lot of uncertainties, but not about sperm. There, the evidence has become rather strong, and it's become clear, so clear that the Indian government has issued warnings about this, that clinics that deal with reproductive problems are routinely advising young men to get those phones out of their pockets, recognizing that this is a hidden hazard to healthy reproduction. This is the data from the Cleveland Clinic showing that men who keep cell phones in their pockets the longest have the lowest sperm count. And again, there are many other studies with similar results. So we can debate legitimately the question of brain cancer, and I would welcome an open and honest debate about that question. But when it comes to issues like this, there really is not much to debate. And it's interesting that the research on this issue comes from people who are expert in male fertility, who started to treat men at infertility clinics and noticed that this was a major contributor to their fertility problems. Now, experimental studies have been done also in India to confirm this kind of damage, not just looking at prenatal exposure or early life exposure, but taking middle-aged rats, 70-day-old male rats, that's middle age for a rat, and exposing them 2 hours a day for 45 days to a computer-generated mobile phone signal. And those results show lower testosterone, which is a very important hormone for a male. Men and women both have testosterone, men just need a lot more of it. And also increases of DNA damage as measured by certain enzymes. And the offspring had lower fertility. And this is just to show you, this is a normal testis. You see the boundaries, the cell wall, it looks very nice. And this is after microwave radiation exposure. So there are some pretty stunning images that have been generated in the basic biology literature when it comes to these kinds of effects.
So I got interested in the question of declining sperm count way back in the mid-90s. Finally, in 2017, I published a study with colleagues. 7 of us published the study that said that there had been a 59% drop in total number of sperm in a sample between 1973 and 2011, 39 years. I call this the 1% effect. The 1% effect is a change of 1% per year over a lot of years. So if sperm count declined 50% in 50 years, that would be 1% per year. But a 50%, that was about what we saw. We saw actually a little worse than that. But a 50% decline means cutting it in half. Cut your sperm count in half. I don't think anyone wants to do that, right? It's the same thing with testosterone. It's also been going down at that same rate, 1% per year. Miscarriage or pregnancy loss has gone up in women at that same rate, and so on and so forth. We don't have good, solid data on all of these. We have much more limited timeframes for these other things because there are many more studies on sperm count than there is on testosterone, for example, trends. But where we can look at it, everything seems to be progressing at about the same rate of deterioration, if you will, of reproductive function. So wherever you look at it, it's not just men and it's not just women. And by the way, it's not just humans, because there are many, many species that have had their genitals disturbed significantly by the same things that are affecting us, and we can talk about what those are. And they've also had their litter size decreased, and they're, basically their species endangered by their declining fertility and reproductive function.
Honeybees have the advantage of being relatively easy to study, and there actually are established protocols for doing this. And I'm going to share with you some of these data. And they have been developed by colleagues from a number of countries. Honeybees have different characteristic dance patterns, and they have different jobs. There's the worker bees, and there's the bees that make the honey, and there's the bees that protect the queen. And I don't know all the details, but here's what I do know. If you try to study these under controlled conditions, you can take hives and put a mobile phone in some hives and a mobile phone in other hives that's not on. And what you can find is that after exposing the honeybees to an operating mobile phone, the workers don't come back to the hives. Now, this ought to be of great concern because agriculture depends on honeybees. I think you in Australia have a new business that's developed, I know it in the United States, where people drive trucks around with hives in it to fertilize crops. Have you heard of this? They drive them around because the honeybees are disappearing. Now, there are many different factors that affect honeybees. Climate, these are newer studies. Here, Hardell from Sweden, and Serenat from France. And what these are showing you is that the relative risk of developing brain cancer with more than 1,640 hours of lifetime use of a phone is almost 3 times higher compared to people who did not use mobile phones. And interestingly, if people started to use phones regularly before age 20, as most of the world is doing now, there was 4 to 8 times more brain cancer after they had passed 10 years.
It just seems like every time we turn around, it gets more confusing. I think there's a lot of misdirection, and I think they've got us looking one way when we need to be really looking at another way, and that's wavelength. I think that in my mind, I used to think the world was Currier and Ives and Norman Rockwell, and unfortunately, you were right long ago when you pointed out the statue of Moloch at our Bohemian Grove, because the world is more like that. We are dealing with. We are serfs in a world that we have not understood, and it's a horrible situation.
So what we did was we utilized the Schumann resonance, the 7.83 hertz. Everybody needs that resonance. It is everywhere, but when it's targeted or localized to a specific device, that can help in greatly harmonizing the frequency that is put out by that device. The Hedron harmonizer has 12 specific minerals and crystals along with scalar energy and the Schumann resonance impregnated into it to give us that frequency effect, that harmonizing effect to the body and to all of our cells. One of the things that makes our device so unique is the scalar energy. Scalar energy occupies the space that it's in, meaning it is more like a field. It's not like a linear wave. So whatever it's connected to, it actually occupies that space and the space around it. So if you can think of an energy field that's in the shape of a donut, really, that space is taken up by this scalar energy, therefore harmonizing any frequencies that come in contact with that device. And the Schumann wave, the 7.83 frequency, is only an enhancement of this scalar energy. These are some of the features of our harmonizer. The California Institute of Electronics Mechanics Sciences, they showed that it shielded up to 99.95% radiation. It's also proven to decrease heat emission by 80%, which is fantastic because I knew that my cellular devices would heat up like crazy if I don't have this on it. And then also, yes, like I said, the scalar technology and the Schumann resonance that we impregnated into the device as well. The specific absorption rate of radiation into the body, it was compliant with that. Yeah, and this was also a big point here. We have 4G right now, and some are saying that we're having the 6G coming soon as well. But our harmonizer is actually rated for 9.375 gigahertz. So it has a big protection gap, if you want to call it that.
I actually have a degree in pharmacology from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Pharmacology is microbiology, but also the study of the synthesis of drug systems, their side effects, and also what was very handy included in that was virology, contact transmission, and epidemiology for pandemics. So of course, it's interesting that I would have had that training to help out in a time like this, and also to take these kind of very complex things and kind of make it easier for the layperson to understand. By the way, this is from the FDA, the United States Food and Drugs Administration. This isn't some conspiracy website or something like that. It's literally from the governing body of the United States government. Now it says, are you experiencing symptoms of exposure radiation? Who made this chart? Look right down here. United States Naval Medical Research. It was declassified in 1972. So up until 1972, they didn't allow, this was a secret document of what the symptoms of exposure to radiation are. Now let's look at what they are. Brain. And I'll just ask you this. With all these cell towers going up, have you experienced increasing headaches, dizziness, nausea, difficulty concentration, depression, anxiety, increasing headaches, dizziness, nausea, difficulty concentration, depression, anxiety, insomnia, fatigue. Fatigue is something that I'll talk about in another video on how the microwave radiation actually interrupts the oxygen transport of myoglobin in your muscles, which makes, if you wake up and you have very stiff muscles or muscle aches, that comes from microwave radiation. Tremors, muscle spasms. Muscle spasms is what's talked about in Safety Code 6. It's nerve stimulation. Okay, so tingling, also nerve stimulation. Altered reflexes, nerve stimulation. Muscle and joint pain, that's a big one. So people most often complain about migraine headaches and joint aches, leg and foot pain. Okay, down here. So now the other ones would be digestive problems, abdominal pain, dehydration, that's a misspelling. Altered sugar metabolisms. Now this is a very interesting thing, and I want to explain that. Altered sugar metabolisms. A lot of people, when they're under a lot of microwave radiation, wind up gaining weight and getting close to type 2 diabetes. And the reason that actually happens is because microwave radiation excites a molecule called a porphyrin. A porphyrin is a very translucent molecule. It's a translucent meaning that it's kind of like a glow-in-the-dark stone. When you give it light, it'll actually absorb the light and it'll retransmit it later, but it hangs on to that energy. And the thing about porphyrins is porphyrins are very, very much the electrical stimulation. We are all just electricity. And so what a porphyrin does is a porphyrin will attach to an iron molecule, which becomes heme in hemoglobin, and that affects the oxygen transport through blood around the body. If you have a porphyrin molecule that's been microwaved and it's constantly buzzing, it doesn't allow the oxygen to attach to it. So what winds up happening is people have a hard time with their oxygen intake. It comes across as hypoxia. It looks like elevation sickness, because they're actually breathing really hard, but they're not able to get enough oxygen in their bodies, and that's hypoxia. And that becomes because the porphyrin molecule has been disturbed enough so that it affects the binding to iron, which then becomes heme for hemoglobin for oxygen transport throughout the body. The way microwaves work is that it actually stimulates water molecules. You'll notice when you put a piece of paper inside a microwave and turn it on, the piece of paper won't get hot. The way that microwaves work is it stimulates and excites the water molecules inside the food, and it rubs them together so fast that it creates heat and it cooks the food from the inside. That's what happens in cellular tower exposure. So the altered sugar metabolisms, I wanted to get back to that, is because porphyrin is actually attached to the last enzyme in what's called the electron transport cycle in the mitochondria, and that affects the uptake of glucose into the cells. And when the glucose cannot come into the cells, then it winds up pooling in the blood. A lot of excess glucose in the blood is elevated glucose, which looks like insulin, starts to pour in, which also looks like type 2 diabetes. When you have a lot of sugar in the blood system, that leads to weight gains. Okay, now eyes. This is one thing I always notice when I go in a high radiation zone. Pressure in or between the eyes. One of the first things that you'll notice when you go into a high radiation zone is your eyes will feel salty, gritty, and dry. You'll have deteriorating visions, and in long-term exposure, you will form cataracts. And that's because like it said in the previous thing, when the eyeball heats up, the excitability of the water, because water in the eyes, in the vitreous humor of the eye, and in the testes does not flow very much, then it winds up pooling and getting cooked. So it's horrible for that. Heart, palpitations and arrhythmia, chest pain or pressure, low or high blood pressure. Let's talk about palpitations, because people, they go, oh my gosh, all of a sudden I'm feeling like, ooh, my heart's racing fast. It's starting to beat really quick. That is because the heart is speeding up we have a pacemaker, and the pacemaker is, of course, electrical, as is the signals that are coming in. Also, it stimulates the pumping of adrenaline. So you'll probably go, my gosh, I don't know why I'm so anxious, or I'm so nervous, or I'm irritable, completely out of nowhere. If you journalists, you'll say, hey, nothing happened. Why am I so ticked off? Why am I so afraid of the future? Yes, of course, there's, the lockdowns and everything like that. But you've probably experienced them before with the increasing level of microwave radiation. This is not something from a conspiracy theory site. This is literally from U.S. Naval Medical Research, and it was declassified in 1972, which means they didn't want you to see it until 1972, but now here we have it. So if you have any of these symptoms, then you could be experiencing symptoms of microwave radiation. And interesting enough, let's look at some of these things. Do they sound a little bit like, so there might be a correlation. Some people are, attributing it to that, but these symptoms, if you present them to a physician, they will definitely test you.
This technology is definitely not going away. I can only see it growing, as I'm sure all of you realize. Our device has patent on it. It also has money-back guarantee, and we have clinical studies. We also carry the Hedron body harmonizer. So what this is, this has the key mineral of shungite in it, which is basically for biofield protection. It's like antioxidant for your biofield. It has everything the cell phone harmonizer has in it, but with the added shungite. This just definitely gives the body an extra boost. I notice it when I'm running and I forget it. Other people that I have worked with are using it. They actually taped it to a joint that has been bothering them on their workouts or their runs because they feel that it does such a great job at keeping their joint from being sore during the run and after the run. So if you're looking for, I guess you could say, a step up on the competition, whether you're a weekend warrior or you're an athlete or whoever, really, this is a great one to have. It also protects against geographic stress as well, if you're familiar with that. Moving on to our home harmonizer. This device has everything the cell phone harmonizer and the body shield have in it, just in different proportions, and specific geometry is involved also with the making of this. This covers 1,000 square feet in a home. Now, if you have a bigger home, you're going to need more of these. But some of the best places to put this would be if you know where a cell phone tower is, and if you look out the window, most of you could probably see one, unfortunately, today. But you want to put it on that wall that's adjacent to where the direction of where that cell phone would be, or on the wall by a smart meter. And it also works great in a person's bedroom, because the number one issue people have that are sensitive to electromagnetic frequencies is they can't sleep. They have an insomnia issue. So it works well in those places. Ideally, if you have a big home or office type setting, you have at least 3 of these, if not 4, on all 4 outside walls of your building. So like I said before, we take care of ourselves in all these different ways, like the exercise, the nutrition, etc. But we don't look at the energy aspect so much. So in order for all of those things to really strengthen our bodies, we have to look at the energy, because we're made up of energy. Remember, everything's made up of energy.
The world is not dangerous because of those who do harm, but because of those who look at it without doing anything. So